In 1944, deep in the Pacific during World War II, an American submarine named USS Tang found itself trapped. Japanese destroyers prowled above, dropping depth charges that shook the steel hull and sent men scrambling. The air grew thick, tense, and silent. Any noise could mean death. The USS Tang had been on patrol for nearly 2 weeks, hunting Japanese shipping lanes that snaked through the island chains of the Pacific. The crew had grown weary but determined, their faces pale under the dim red lights that flickered through the narrow passageways. The constant hum of machinery, the soft whir of the propeller shafts, and the occasional hiss of compressed air were the submarine's heartbeat, steady, mechanical, alive. Captain Richard O'Kane, the commanding officer of the Tang, stood silently in the control room, his jaw tight. He had faced danger before, but this was different. The destroyers had triangulated their position after a successful torpedo strike earlier that morning. What was once a victorious hunt had turned into a desperate struggle to survive. "Depth at 300 feet and holding, sir," whispered the diving officer, his voice barely audible over the faint creak of the hull. O'Kane gave a single nod, eyes fixed on the depth gauge. Every foot deeper brought new risks, the hull groaning under the crushing pressure, rivets popping like gunfire in the silence. Yet staying still was their only chance. The Japanese sonar, if it picked up even a whisper of noise, would guide the destroyer's next barrage directly onto their heads. The men waited. Sweat rolled down faces despite the cold steel environment. Inside the submarine, the air was stale, heavy with diesel fumes and human breath. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the distant thunder of exploding depth charges. Each blast made the submarine tremble, like a living creature recoiling in pain. Then came the metallic echo of another explosion, closer this time. The lights flickered. A pipe above the mess hall burst open, spraying a mist of condensation over the sailors crouched nearby. A young torpedoman muttered a prayer under his breath, clutching the small cross that hung from his neck. In the galley, Chief Petty Officer Marty Keller, the ship's cook, gripped the edge of the counter to keep his balance as another explosion rippled through the hull. Pots clattered, and the faint smell of burned coffee filled the air. The men had joked before that Marty could cook a meal in a hurricane. Now he was cooking in hell. O'Kane paced slowly through the cramped control room, whispering orders. Every sound was measured, every movement deliberate. Even a dropped wrench could mean the end. The sonar man listened with a headset pressed to his ears, eyes shut, sweat glistening on his brow. "Multiple contacts above," he breathed. Three destroyers, moving in a pattern. They're sweeping the area." O'Kane leaned over the plotting table, studying the faint pencil marks that represented enemy positions. "They're hunting by ear," he said softly. "If we stay silent, they might pass." But the destroyers were relentless. Another wave of depth charges fell, shaking the Tang like a rattle in a child's hand. Meters cracked, glass shattered, and somewhere in the aft section, a light bulb burst. The crew froze, hearts pounding, waiting for the sound to betray them. A silence followed, long, suffocating, unnatural. The crew exchanged nervous glances. Silence could mean safety, or it could mean the enemy was listening. In that darkness, the men thought of home, of wives, of children, of warm kitchens and quiet mornings. The youngest sailor aboard, barely 19, whispered to his bunkmate, "Do you think they know we're still down here?" His voice trembled with both fear and hope. "No," came the quiet reply. "And that's the only reason we're still alive." Minutes turned into hours. The oxygen levels dropped. Every breath felt heavier, slower. Someone coughed, then quickly covered his mouth as if to trap the sound. The steel walls seemed to close in tighter with every passing second. The destroyers continued their pattern above, listening for any sign of life. Occasionally, a propeller AS churn echoed faintly through the water, a haunting reminder that death was hovering just above their heads. O'Kane finally broke the silence, his voice low but steady. "We hold our depth, No noise, no movement. We wait them out. The crew obeyed. They were a family forged in fire and fear, bound by trust in their captain and in each other. Yet even the bravest hearts began to falter as time dragged on. The air grew fouler, the pressure more unbearable. Every creak of the hull sounded like a whisper of doom. In the dim galley light, Keller leaned back against the bulkhead, staring at the ceiling. He could hear the faint groan of steel above him, the ghosts of the sea pressing closer. Around him, jars rattled, utensils quivered, and the smell of spoiled food from the storage locker made the air even more suffocating. He thought of all the meals he'd cooked aboard, the laughter, the teasing, the little jokes that had kept morale alive through endless patrols. Now, that same kitchen felt like a coffin. Yet in Keller's mind, ideas were beginning to form. Strange, absurd ideas born from desperation and a cook's peculiar resourcefulness. But for now, the crew waited, entombed in silence. The destroyers continued their deadly dance above, and every man aboard the USS Tang knew that one wrong sound, a cough, a whisper, a slip of metal, could summon the sea to swallow them whole. The trap had been set, and the hunters circled. In the cold darkness of the Pacific, the USS Tang hung suspended between life and death, silent, motionless, waiting for a miracle. For long minutes, Keller just stood in the dim galley, staring at the rust-colored pots and the dented metal counters that had been his domain for months. The low hum of the submarine's engines was barely audible, and the air was thick with the stale scent of oil, sweat, and fear. Every man aboard the USS Tang was holding his breath, literally and figuratively, waiting for the Japanese destroyers above to make their next move. Keller's mind churned restlessly. He was a cook, not a strategist, not a weapons officer, not a man used to command. His world was measured in cups and ladles, not bearings and depth readings. Yet he could feel it, the tension that gripped the submarine tighter than the ocean pressure outside. The men were close to breaking. Their air was running low, and so was hope. The thought came to him like a flicker, absurd, grotesque, yet strangely clear. He looked around the galley. The leftovers from the last meal sat in a metal bucket, wilted vegetables, coffee dregs, bits of spoiled meat that had turned grayish in the warm, recycled air. It smelled awful, but Keller barely noticed. He'd been working with such scraps for weeks. The war didn't exactly allow for luxury. He muttered to himself, rubbing his temple. If only they thought we were dead. That's when it struck him. The Japanese above were looking for signs of life, sounds, movement, bubbles. But what if they were shown signs of death instead? A false wreck, a fake grave at sea. Something to make the enemy believe that the USS Tang had already met her end. The plan was insane, and he knew it. But insanity sometimes made sense in war. He began to move with quiet purpose, pulling open the galley's cold storage bins. Inside were the remnants of spoiled cabbage, a crusted layer of grease from the fryers, and a few chunks of meat so far gone that even the rats in port would eyed turned away. He wrinkled his nose but didn't hesitate. Slowly, he began scooping the vile collection into burlap sacks, each scoop releasing a wave of stench that made his stomach lurch. He added coffee grounds for texture. They looked like burnt debris in the water, and poured in a layer of cooking oil from a dented tin, knowing it would spread like an oily sheen on the sea's surface. One of the sailors passing by the galley door stopped, covering his mouth. "Marty, what in God's name are you doing?" Keller didn't look up. "Cooking," he said dryly. "Just not the kind you're used to." The sailor frowned, watching as the cook tied up one of the sacks and set it aside. The smell was unbearable now, filling the narrow corridor. It spread through the sub like poison, drawing the attention of more men who peeked in, gagging, whispering and shaking their heads. "Chief, you gone crazy?" another asked, half laughing, half dreading the answer. "You're gonna fumigate us before the Japs even get the chance." Keller finally straightened, wiping his hands on a rag that was already stained from years of grease. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm gonna make them think we're already dead." Silence followed. Confused, wary silence. The idea sounded too strange to grasp. But in the eyes of the men, curiosity began to replace despair. They didn't know what he meant, but they trusted him. Keller wasn't just the cook. He was the heart of the boat, the one who cracked jokes, the one who always managed to serve something warm even after a battle. If he had an idea, maybe, just maybe, it was worth listening to. Captain Richard O'Kane arrived moments later, drawn by the growing commotion. His face was pale from exhaustion, his voice hoarse. "What's going on here?" Keller stood at attention instinctively, though the smell around him was anything but military. "Captain, sir," he said firmly, "I think I can make the Japanese believe we've been sunk." O'Kane blinked. "You're a cook, Keller, not a magician." "Maybe, sir. But I know smells. I know what rot looks like. If I mix this right, grease, meat, cabbage, oil, it'll look like a wreck. They'll think it's debris from a hit. If we let it float up, it might fool their eyes and sonar both." The captain studied him for a long, tense moment. The idea was absurd, and yet, absurd ideas sometimes won wars. Finally, O'Kane said quietly, "Do it, but make it fast." That was all Keller needed. He worked feverishly, sweat pouring down his temples as he mixed and stuffed the foul concoction into sack after sack. The smell grew so strong that even the diesel fumes couldn't mask it. Some men covered their noses with their sleeves. Others joked nervously to keep from retching. "Smells like a graveyard in here," one muttered. "Good," Keller replied, tying off another sack. "That's exactly what I want them to think." He dragged the sacks toward the aft hatch, each one heavy and leaking an oily residue. The men followed, helping in silence now. What had begun as madness was starting to look like a real plan, one that could buy them their lives. Each sack represented a gamble, a desperate bluff in a deadly game. The Japanese destroyers were still out there, circling, listening. But if Keller's deception worked, they might be tricked into believing that the USS Tang had already perished beneath the waves. The cook wiped his brow, leaving a streak of grime across his face. "It's the foulest thing I've ever made," he said, managing a tired grin. "But maybe it's the finest meal I'll ever serve." The men chuckled softly, their laughter half relief, half disbelief. It wasn't courage that filled the submarine now. It was something quieter, stranger. Hope, reborn in the smell of rot and grease. Keller's disgusting idea was taking shape. Soon, they would release it into the sea and pray that the enemy above would take the bait. In the cramped, suffocating silence of the Pacific depths, one man's grotesque imagination might just become the key to survival. The USS Tang moved silently, rising inch by inch toward the surface, the hum of its engines subdued to a whisper. Every man aboard was tense, eyes glued to the dim red lights, ears straining for any sign of disaster. The sacks of foul matter were now in Keller's hands, heavy and slick, a grotesque arsenal against the enemy. The stench filled the hatchway as he carefully pried it open, peering at the dark, choppy water above. The Pacific was cold and black, reflecting nothing but the faint glimmer of distant stars and the shadowy forms of the enemy destroyers on the surface. Keller hesitated for only a moment. The responsibility weighed on him far more than any pot of stew ever had. One wrong move, and the sacks could slip prematurely or float away harmlessly, exposing the Tang to imminent attack. He glanced at the crew, who were frozen with nervous anticipation. Every man knew that their lives now rested in the hands of the ship's cook, in his ability to make the enemy see death instead of life. With careful precision, Keller began to hurl the first sack overboard. It hit the water with a sickening splash, releasing a plume of dark, greasy liquid and chunks of decomposed food that floated upward like morbid confetti. The smell immediately reached the sub, curling through the hatch and seeping into every corner of the control room and galley. The men gagged but held firm, understanding the stakes. One by one, the remaining sacks followed, each tossed overboard with the meticulous aim of creating a believable field of wreckage. The cabbage, once green and crisp, now appeared as brown clumps of decaying vegetation. The coffee grounds spread like charred soil, and the oily sheen from the grease created an unnatural glimmer across the water's surface. Even the rotting meat, bloated and gray, added to the illusion, pieces bobbing eerily, resembling parts of a hull torn apart by depth charges. Below in the control room, the sonar operator's headset crackled faintly. Sir, we're picking up something on the surface," he whispered, voice tense. The captain moved closer, eyes narrowing. "What is it?" The operator's hand trembled as he adjusted the dials, listening intently. "It's debris. Floating pieces. Looks like wreckage, sir. Possibly from a sub. Could be ours. Or theirs." O'Kane exhaled slowly, keeping his face calm while his mind raced. The timing, the placement, the subtle patterns of debris, it all matched a sunken submarine convincingly. The destroyers above, using their sonar, would detect irregularities in the water, patches of floating refuse, oil slicks and bubbles, and assume they had scored a kill. On the surface, the Japanese crews aboard the destroyers observed the floating mess. One officer pointed to the spreading slick and barked orders, urging his men to take pictures, record notes, and confirm the presence of wreckage. There was a brief discussion in hurried Japanese, tense voices rising over the noise of the ship and sea. After a few tense minutes, the officers reached a conclusion. The oily sheen and floating debris had the markings of a destroyed submarine, likely American. Below, the crew of the Tang waited, barely daring to breathe. They could hear the muffled sounds of the destroyers above. Orders shouted, metal creaking under the weight of anxious men. Then faintly, they could hear the retreat of engines, propellers churning as the destroyers began to move away. Every second felt like an eternity. The sticky, metallic taste of fear lingered in their mouths. Keller, still at the hatch, could barely believe his eyes. The sacks had done their job perfectly. The oily water, the floating food, the grotesque clumps of decomposed matter. It all had convinced the enemy that the USS Tang had been obliterated beneath the waves. He allowed himself a small, silent smile, keeping his expression neutral for the men watching. Even as the destroyers pulled back, they did not return. Their sonar operators had recorded the slick, convinced they were leaving a sunken enemy behind. Their weapons were idle, their hunt temporarily over. Above the ocean, the surface appeared calm once more, waves lapping against the hull of the Tang as though nothing had happened. The crew of the Tang remained crouched and silent for several minutes, ensuring the danger had truly passed. Then, tentative glances were exchanged, eyes met with unspoken relief. They began to breathe more freely, shoulders relaxing slightly, though the adrenaline still thrummed through their veins. The threat had been neutralized, not by torpedoes, not by cunning maneuvers, but by the grotesque ingenuity of their cook. Keller finally climbed down from the hatch, wiping his hands on a grimy rag, though the smell of his weapon clung to him. He looked around at the men, seeing their awe and disbelief. They were stunned, amazed that a few burlap sacks filled with garbage could have saved the submarine from certain destruction. The stench was still overwhelming, yet it now carried a strange sense of triumph. Captain O'Kane, standing in the control room, gave a small nod, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Well done, Keller," he said quietly. "You just bought us more than time. You bought us life." The Tang, still below the surface but free from immediate danger, moved slowly to a safer depth. The tension began to ebb, replaced by cautious relief. Above, the Pacific stretched calm and silent once more, hiding the extraordinary act that had just unfolded beneath its waves. The trick had worked, a grotesque, revolting, and ingenious trick that no one would forget. Inside the Tang, the crew sat in stunned silence, realizing the cook's disgusting plan had saved them all. The heavy tension that had gripped the submarine for hours began to ebb, replaced by an overwhelming mixture of relief, disbelief, and awe. Men who had been pale and tense, hearts hammering against their chests, now slumped in their bunks, letting out breaths they hadn't realized they were holding. The stench of the burlap sacks still lingered in the air, a pungent, almost nauseating reminder of what had just transpired. Yet that very stench now carried a sense of triumph. The crew exchanged glances, half laughing, half shaking their heads in amazement. No one could quite believe that a concoction of rotten cabbage, spoiled meat, coffee grounds, and grease, what had seemed to them an act of sheer madness moments earlier, had fooled the Japanese destroyers and spared their lives. Marty Keller, standing near the galley hatch, tried to maintain a composed demeanor, but a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. The weight of responsibility pressed on him less now, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. He had always considered himself just the cook, the man responsible for keeping morale high and stomachs fed. But in that moment, he realized he had done something far greater. He had preserved the lives of 50 men, kept a legendary vessel from sinking, and turned the tide of a desperate moment with nothing but ingenuity and a foul sense of resourcefulness. Around him, the crew began to talk softly, whispers of admiration and astonishment floating through the confined space of the submarine. "Did you see the way the destroyers backed off?" one sailor muttered, still incredulous. Another shook his head, saying, "I never thought a kitchen could be more dangerous than a torpedo tube." Laughter erupted, quiet but genuine, a release of tension that had been building for hours. Captain Richard O'Kane moved through the submarine, surveying the relieved faces of his crew. His eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, now carried a rare warmth. He approached Keller, whose hands were still grimy from handling the burlap sacks. Without a word, he clapped the cook firmly on the shoulder, the gesture both a mark of respect and a recognition of heroism. "You just cooked us out of a grave," O'Kane said, his voice steady but imbued with emotion. It was a phrase that would become legendary, a testament to the ingenuity and courage of the man who had turned rot into salvation. Keller nodded, acknowledging the praise with quiet humility, aware that no words could truly capture the magnitude of what had just happened. The rest of the crew began to gather around, patting Keller on the back, shaking his hand, offering murmurs of thanks. Each gesture, though simple, was filled with deep gratitude. They had been moments from destruction, caught in the deadly embrace of the Pacific, and it was their cook who had guided them through. The realization settled over them like a gentle tide, a profound understanding that heroism could come from the most unexpected places, and that courage sometimes wore the guise of absurdity. As the submarine finally resurfaced under the cover of night, the dark waters around them glimmered faintly in the light of a distant moon. The ocean seemed calm, serene, almost oblivious to the events that had just unfolded beneath its surface. Above, the stars stretched endlessly across the sky, silent witnesses to the ingenuity of a single man who had turned desperation into survival. The Tang's crew began to restore order within the submarine. The hatches were secured, instruments checked, and the hum of machinery gradually returned to its usual rhythm. Yet beneath the routine, there was a shared sense of wonder, an unspoken acknowledgement that they had witnessed something extraordinary, something that would remain with them forever. Keller moved quietly through the submarine, cleaning what he could, organizing supplies, and performing his usual tasks. But each motion carried a new weight, a newfound significance. He was no longer just a cook. In the eyes of the men he served with, he was a savior, a strategist, a man whose creativity and courage had rewritten the rules of survival in the most extraordinary way. Stories of bravery often focused on combat, on the roar of guns and the flash of torpedoes. But in that confined steel vessel beneath the waves, the crew of the Tang had learned a different kind of heroism, one born not of weapons, but of wit, resourcefulness, and the courage to act decisively in the face of overwhelming odds. The foul sacks that had floated atop the Pacific would never be forgotten in their memories, a symbol of life preserved through ingenuity and determination. From that night on, Marty Keller's reputation spread. He was no longer merely the man who cooked meals aboard the USS Tang. He was the man who had saved a submarine with garbage, the cook whose mind and bravery had outwitted the enemy. Among the crew, he became a legend, his story told in hushed, reverent tones whenever new sailors joined the vessel. The tale of the disgusting plan was recounted again and again, growing with each retelling, a testament to the unpredictable, extraordinary ways in which courage manifests. Even long after the war, when the USS Tang returned to port and the crew disbanded, the story of Marty Keller endured. Friends and fellow servicemen remembered the cook who had faced annihilation not with guns, but with ingenuity, transforming the very refuse of their galley into a lifeline. It was a story that carried laughter, horror, and profound admiration. A story that proved that heroism could come in the most unexpected forms. Inside the Tang that night, the crew finally allowed themselves to relax, to breathe freely, and to laugh. The tension that had gripped them so tightly melted into quiet camaraderie, a bond strengthened by shared fear, relief, and the recognition of a singular act of ingenuity. And at the center of it all stood Marty Keller, the cook who had hidden a submarine with garbage, the man who had turned the grotesque into salvation, and whose name would forever be remembered as a symbol of clever courage in the face of certain death.